The Wild have to overcome the loss of their best player and now face a suspension. The Washington Capitals are on the move with Alexander Ovechkin getting ever closer to Wayne Gretzky, and the New York Rangers pulled the trigger on a big deal to reacquire JT Miller. We've got all that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the one and only Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild, and never a dull moment for the Wild, but certainly would like some better news than what you've been getting. Obviously, let's start with the Kaprizov injury. The best player on the team going to miss, 4 weeks estimated? How does the Wild get through these 4 weeks without Kaprizov?
Well, I think they put the blueprint on the table in the first 2 games after Kaprizov, after it was announced that he was going to be having surgery. The Wild beat Chicago and they beat Montreal, and in those 2 games they had 7 different players score goals. So it's going to have to be a committee approach. This is a team that has made their way so far this year by playing really stingy defense, getting really good goaltending, and getting timely scoring. You know, if they can get a couple of players to give them goals here or there, or a couple of lines that can give them goals on any given night, that's going to go a long way for them winning games. Unfortunately, then you had what happened against the Ottawa Senators, which is just nowhere near what the team needs to do. And I can forgive a lot, Gil. I can forgive just not having it. You know, for whatever reason, you go in and that night you don't have your best stuff. But I can't really forgive the no-shows. And this is a Wild team that has won a ton of games on the road, and they just walked into Ottawa thinking it was the Ottawa teams of old and that they were going to be able to sleepwalk their way to 2 points. And boy, did Ottawa prove them wrong. 3 power play goals, a shorthanded goal. So those demons are still kind of lurking for this Minnesota Wild team. If they are going to keep the blueprint going that John Hines has put together, it requires that they play very, very within themselves. Nobody tries to do too much. Nobody tries to take the game into their own hands, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But it's just the blueprint and the formula is right there, and yet I think it's equally as frustrating too, because you had such a good effort game against the Montreal Canadiens. Because the team wanted to win one from Marc-Andre Fleury. They were laying out to try to make things happen. And you just get the polar opposite against the Ottawa Senators. And so I don't know if it just was the assumption of, you know, we've won a ton of games on the road, so we can just show up and that's going to be enough. That's not the case in the NHL. So the blueprint is there, but that doesn't make what happened in their most recent game any less frustrating.
Are there any players in particular? I mean, you said it's picking this offense up by committee, but are there a couple of guys who you think are the keys to allowing that to happen?
The team is going to lean on the likes of Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, Matt Zuccarello. Those are probably your top 3 guys from a scoring perspective that you really need to be the ones driving the bus, pushing the tempo. But the thing that has been really refreshing over the last couple of games here since the surgery announcement was the Wild were getting an actual scoring component from their 4th line, something that has just been completely non-existent through most of the season. They had scored 2 goals, and they scored against Chicago. They scored against Montreal. Obviously didn't score against Ottawa at all, but if the Wild can get a couple of players to kind of take the lead And then, okay, tonight it's going to be the fourth line. Tonight it's going to be the third line. Tonight it's going to be the second line. That can win them games. It's just a matter of making sure that those guys at the top don't go too cold, because those are the stretches that you really just can't afford to have at this point.
Got to ask about the possible and probable suspension of Ryan Hartman. Talk to me about what happened, why it happened, and what do you expect the Department of Player Safety to come down with?
So what this stemmed from was Hartman believed that he was the victim of what should have been a penalty. Tim Stützle, I think, slashed him at a point earlier in the game. Hartman thought it should have been a penalty. He took exception to it, obviously. And so then later on in the game, he elected to essentially pile drive Stützle's head into the ice. His helmet came off. He had a large gash on his face. So at that point, then Hartman gets the match penalty, and already the league has sent him an invitation for an in-person hearing, which means that the potential for upwards of 5 or 6 games for suspension is on the table. What Ryan Hartman does not have going for him in this case, and I'll get to what the suspension is likely going to be, because there is going to be a suspension.
Yeah.
Because this is his fifth offense. So repeat offender, to say the least. So this is going to be a 5 or 6 game suspension, which will likely take up the rest of the month of February. And I understand being frustrated about not having a penalty called when you feel like it was a pretty blatant penalty that should have been called. But why are you taking it out? Why are you taking it out on the opposing team? Because guess what happened, Gil, after Hartman got the match penalty and the Senators got their 5-minute power play. They scored 3 power play goals in about 20 seconds. So you are then having to sit in the locker room and watch your team have to try to cover your rear end because you got selfish and decided that you were going to take the game into your own hands. That I do not have any time for. I cannot stand for that. Frankly, it was embarrassing because earlier in the day, we had recorded, me and Locked On Senators recorded a nice preview of the game. We were excited for it because the Senators are good for the first time in ever, and we were excited for what should have been a fun matchup. But then this kind of stuff happens, and it just takes all the fun out of the game. And then you're fielding questions about whether or not your team is dirty, whether you've got goon players on the roster. And I don't have any time for that. So whatever Hartman gets as a suspension is more than deserved. And he's going to put the team in a real bind by being on the bench for probably 5 or 6 games.
And obviously with Kaprizov out, you need all hands on deck. And now you're missing another key player.
Yeah. And it was to the point now the team has put Kirill on long-term injured reserve to be able to afford to have an extra roster spot. But before that, they would have had to put somebody on waivers in order to even get an extra player on the roster. Because for a suspension, you're on the roster. You don't get roster relief for that. So there's a lot of different wrinkles that cost them in the game because of the 3 power play goals that the Senators scored. And, just seeing reaction from Sens fans saying, like, let's keep running the score up and being like, honestly, do it. You just had it coming. And now having to deal with losing a guy that you expect to be a scorer on this team for 6 games, it just puts the team further behind the 8 ball at this point.
Trade deadline is about a month away right now, and you're going to have 10 days off for 4 nations in that time period. I know there's not a lot of cap space right now, but what, if anything, do you expect the Wild to do? Because they're, not comfortably in a playoff spot right now.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because you would think by having all this long-term LTIR cap relief that you'd be able to go out and do something. Well, we don't play by the same rules that Tampa Bay and Vegas do, because the Wild are hoping that Kirill will be able to come back well before the season is done. So you got to be able to be cap compliant to get him back on the roster. So you can't really go out and get a $5 or $6 million guy and just say, "Oh, we'll figure it out later." Like, you're going to need Kirill down the stretch to either solidify where you're at in the standings right now, or to be playing hot potato with the rest of the wild card hopefuls for that wild card 1 or wild card 2 spot. So you're going to need him back. So that limits what the Wild are able to do. They're going to need, if they do anything, they're going to need a broker. Like, they're going to need to have somebody take on probably the other 50%. You're going to need to have the team controlling the player you're looking at retain 50%. So just as these injuries mount, it's looking less and less likely that the Wild will do anything major, maybe a depth piece, but I won't say no, because one thing that Bill Guerin has done throughout his tenure is he seems to be able to pull a card out of his sleeve pretty regularly. So I know the trendy link is your guy, Brock Nelson, but you got to contend with the fact now that the Islanders are playing better hockey and are probably going to try to talk themselves into being buyers. So Brock Nelson probably off the table, which kind of leads me towards maybe they try to pull a blockbuster and get Brock Besser. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But just the way things are kind of trending, I don't get the sense that there's going to be much, if anything, done at the deadline.
All right, Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Make sure to check out Locked On Wild. We'll have plenty of reaction to the looming suspension for Ryan Hartman, and just an absolute egg of a game against the Senators, as well as just teeing up here the rest of the week. As we get closer to the Four Nations face-off, you can check out Locked On Wild on social media and on YouTube, and you can follow me at Seth, Toups, as me, a casual basketball fan, tries to figure out what the heck the Dallas Mavericks are doing with Luka Doncic.
Yeah, a lot of people trying to figure that out. Seth, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Just bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Capitals, Dan Holmi. And Dan, let's start with the Ovechkin update here. He is closing in on Wayne Gretzky, and he just continues to be extremely productive, more than a point a game, and just keeps scoring those goals.
Yeah, we love to see it. Reaching 877 now, just 18 goals away from overtaking Wayne Gretzky. And the thing I like about him are the good goals. I hate that because that's redundant, but good goals, getting them while 5-on-5, that oftentimes some of the things that have been said against him is he's getting these goals, but they're empty netters. Listen, at this point, we'll take him how we can get him. He's under contract for this season, next season. So if he has to get some empty netters to get it done, I'm all about it.
Do you think in any way that this chase is a distraction for this team? Is it an inspiration for this team? How does it affect the other 17 guys on the ice and the goalies?
Well, Ovechkin is good at deflecting. Oftentimes he is asked about catching Gretzky all the time. And he said, listen, more important than me catching and passing Gretzky is winning another Stanley Cup while I'm wearing a Capitals jersey. And like I say, he is only going to be here this season and next season. So I think that is a clever way on his part to say, I don't want to talk about it. I want to win another cup while I'm here. But I think all things considered that it is the team likes to rally around him. They like to feed him the puck. And Spencer Carberry, if there's ever an empty net, is make sure that Alex Ovechkin is on the ice. But I don't think it's been too much of a distraction. I think that the Capitals are ultimately happy for him, and they're trying to do whatever it takes to help him score goals. And in turn, if he's scoring goals, good chance the Capitals are winning games.
Yeah, no question about that. As far as winning games, though, seems to be a little bump in the road now. Lost 3 of their last 4, although, that game against Winnipeg over the weekend was very entertaining, went to overtime. What has sort of been the issue with this team over the last 4 games or so?
Well, I mean, like I was talking to you in the pre-interview, the game against Ottawa, if you didn't have any context about the Senators, say they're wearing just blank jerseys, you would say that is one heck of a hockey team until you find out who they are, and then you think to yourself, they're nothing. But the Capitals have just struggled against some of these teams that really cycle the puck very well, and also defensive breakdowns, those kind of things, spending too much time in the defensive zone instead of the offensive zones. And just the little things like that, not playing a complete game, not stick-to-stick passing or tape-to-tape passing. So it's the little things. And, it's kind of a cliche to say that you have to play a 60-minute game. But 9 times out of 10 here, the Capitals have been playing a 20-minute game or maybe a 40-minute game that I think if they got back to the basics, what worked for them well to start the season, setting up for those greasy goals in front of the net there. That has been part of the secret sauce for Connor McMichael and that kind of thing. They can get back into the win column. But as far as the Jets are concerned, they are a very good team and one to be reckoned with. Capitals got hellebucked the other night there, and I think that it was kind of the same thing. They got it down by a 2-goal deficit. They rallied, but ultimately lost in OT. So they got 2 loser points, I guess you could say, in the last couple games. But ultimately, we're looking for them to clean it up so we don't have to have these games go back to overtime and get back to what works best in Caps playing those complete games.
Got to ask about Logan Thompson. He has had an outstanding year statistically. What has he meant to this team this season, and how big a part of their success is he?
Huge. The Capitals play very confident in front of Logan Thompson. And it's interesting going into this season. There was a lot of questions that it was going to be a battle between Charlie Lindgren and Logan Thompson. Well, Logan Thompson has definitely taken the reins and run with it, coming strong off a new contract. And to be clear here, the game against the Jets, I don't think that any netminder could have won that game, but the Capitals have played very confidently in front of him. I guess some of the more long-term questions is what does that mean in that big picture? Does Charlie Lindgren get a new contract? Ultimately, how much money do they want to tie up into netminding? But I'm feeling pretty confident just because I hear the salary cap is going to be going up over the next 3 seasons.
Alexander Ovechkin gets most of the attention nationwide, but give me an idea of some players who aren't making headlines, but are really helping this Capitals team win hockey games.
Well, if you take a look at it, there are 9 players on the Capitals right now in double digits in goal. You take a look at it, Pierre-Luc Dubois is the kind of guy, he is a familiar name, but one of the guys that was criticized in the offseason, the Capitals traded Darcy Kemper for Pierre-Luc Dubois in the snickering and the people going, hey, Dan, how is that going to go for you? I'm going to tell you how it's going to go. It's been going very well. He's put up 12 goals in 30 assists. He has been the secret sauce. He has been the guy stirring the drink primarily on the second line. He has elevated the game of Connor McMichael. He's elevated the game of Tom Wilson. That Pierre-Luc Dubois, despite what some people thought, I think he is one hell of a player, well-liked in the locker room, and was just a stroke of genius by former GM Brian McClellan.
The trade deadline is now a little more than a month away. You've got the 10-day break in the middle of that for four nations. You mentioned that Alex Ovechkin is here this year and next year. You got to think the Caps are all in. What are they looking for at the trade deadline?
Stability on the third line is the big thing. That has been the bugaboo of this team all season long. We've seen a lot of different players cycle through the third line. We traded for and acquired Lars Eller to add some stability, but he's not the Lars Eller from the 2018 Stanley Cup team. Let's put it that way. So I think that they need to go out and sign some depth players, but I also think that they need to sign just some skilled forwards in general, just given the fact that, it's been Ivan Mirshnyshenko and Jacob Vrana and Sonny Milano, these guys constantly cycling through. That the biggest glaring need for me is the third line. But as far as defense is concerned, you can never have enough depth. We saw what happened to the Capitals a couple seasons ago when John Carlson missed a substantial amount of time playing 25 to 30 minutes last season because of deficiencies. So, but Chikrin and Roy have been huge for this team. But the biggest need, to answer your question, is a skilled forward. We talked about a potential guy on the Islanders that could potentially help out the Capitals. But a player like Brock Nelson or a Yanni Gord, something of that nature, even though I'm against the idea of a rental, the Capitals are in a unique position that I think they could truly do great things if they pick up two big pieces. And I hope that Chris Patrick is busy between the four nations and the trade deadline.
And what do you think the Capitals would look to give up in exchange for this depth that they're looking to get?
Well, that's where it gets a little bit sticky, or it gets a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, as the Capitals have a lot of depth, primarily a glut of talent, if you will, on the blue line with prospects and down in Hershey in the ECHL. So I would expect they would be going after one of the Capitals' defensemen, as there's a lot of teams looking to shore things up there. But this is something that's a little bit out in the weeds here. There are a lot of teams out there that are looking for stability in net. Pittsburgh Penguins comes to mind. I'm talking to you right now, that potentially I think that Charlie Lindgren could be dealt. And I know that some people could say, oh my God, did Dan just say that? I really think it's possible because they have a great talent down in Hershey with Hunter Shepard and Clay Stevenson, that I think the Capitals should really widen the lens, get a 30,000-foot view of this team, and get aggressive if they are all, in fact, on wanting to make a playoff push and, dare I say, a Stanley Cup win.
Going to be interesting. I know you'll have it covered every step of the way. Dan, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. And of course, the podcast is available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On New York Rangers, John Chick. And John, you could say a lot of things about the Ranger season, but dull is not one of them. A big trade made earlier in the week as JT Miller returns to the Rangers. Your thoughts on the impact that this deal will have both short-term and long-term?
Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously these rumors have been out there for a while. So when the trade actually does happen, the trigger actually does get pulled, it's not like you're super shocked by it, but there is still that kind of moment of like, oh, wow, this actually just happened. Like we're really doing this. JT Miller is really coming back to the Rangers. And, for the most part, I like it. I know there's certain fans that have certain reservations about it, whether it has to do with JT Miller's price tag, whether it has to do with the length of the contract, the full no move clause that he'll have for a couple more seasons here, or, some of the issues that he's had, I guess, on and off the ice, you can say, with, him being a little bit of a volatile player. Sometimes that works in his favor, sometimes it works against him. But overall, I like the move. The bottom line, when this guy is right, and, he's right more often than not, even when there is a whole bunch of drama surrounding him, he's a top 20 player in the NHL. And the Rangers just brought him back here by giving up Philip Hedl, who I think Ranger fans really like. The guy's been through a lot with all the concussions and everything, but he was the Ranger third line center. You give him up, and you give up a promising defenseman and Victor Mancini, but bottom line, a former 5th-round pick and the protected first-rounder as well. I think you got to do that trade. I just don't see how, if you're the Rangers, even though there is some risk, even though this could go one of about a million different ways with JT Miller on the Rangers, I don't see how you say no to that deal. And they pounce on it. And we were talking about this just a second ago, so I'll throw this in here now. I also think that this deal is more about next season than it is this season. Sure, they would still love to make the playoffs this year, and they're at least in the mix. They've got a chance at it. But I think that the Rangers are looking to do a retooling of their roster rather than a full-on rebuild. We saw teams like the Caps and the Devils, to look right at the Metro Division. They both did that from last year to this year, and they're obviously in a much better place this year than they were a year ago. And I think the Rangers are thinking they can do the same thing, and JT Miller is kind of the centerpiece of that, bring him in for the next bunch of years here.
Where does JT Miller fit into this lineup, and who do you think benefits the most from his addition?
Yeah, so what they've been doing so far is they've had him on the top line centering Artemi Panarin and Mika Zibanejad. That's interesting in and of itself because Mika's now playing the wing, which is something that, other than like maybe a game or two with the Rangers, I don't think I've ever seen him do that, at least not with any, regularity. The conventional wisdom here was that if the Rangers were going to go with Trocheck, Mika, and Miller all in the top 6, that Miller would be the guy maybe to move to a wing because he's done it before. The other two really haven't. But they're trying this, and hey, they got the win today, so we'll give them props for that. Curious to see how it plays out as far as the lineup is concerned going forward. As far as who benefits the most from it, I mean, I would say maybe Artemi Panarin because he's out there now with obviously a bona fide superstar player, just like he himself is, and I think those two styles can play well off of each other. Obviously, JT Miller is willing to go in there, do some of the dirty work, and all that good stuff. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I think it's more the team as a whole because this roster is just starved for a player like this, a guy that's going to go in there, throw his weight around, play with some edge, play with some intensity. We've already seen a couple different, JT Miller extracurriculars in these first 2 games with the pushing and the shoving during a play stoppage, whatever it might be. He's somebody that's going to go in there and assert himself right away. And again, I think the Rangers need a player like that. And it all comes back to the price being right, and he's here, and I think the deal was the right thing to do if you're the Rangers.
He had 2 assists in the win over Vegas on Sunday. How important was it to end that 3-game losing streak and beat a very good Vegas Golden Knights team?
Yeah, huge. I mean, I think that, first of all, the first reason why you really like this win is that they did in this game what they did about a million times last year and have only done twice this year, and that is they came back and won after being down going into the third period. Last year, you'd be down by a goal watching this Ranger team going into the third, and you would honestly think like, man, we got them right where we want them. We're going to come back. We're going to win this game. Maybe it'll go to overtime. Who knows? But the Rangers will find a way to get it done. That feeling hasn't been there this year because they just haven't done it this year. So it's a huge win for that reason. Awesome to see Jonathan Quick get win number 400. That's obviously a incredibly impressive milestone and what a legendary career. But as far as like bigger picture, the playoff standings, the way things are right now, the Rangers are still within striking distance, as is just about everybody in the Eastern Conference. But if you lose 3 games in a row, which the Rangers just did, or even 2 games in a row, you're going to sink like a stone in the standings because it's just so tight and all the teams around you, everybody's so bunched together. Not all those teams are going to lose. So if you're losing 2 in a row, somebody else is going to win 2 in a row, and this team goes 1-0-1. You get the idea, but you're going to be losing serious ground very quickly if you go through any kind of a losing streak right now. And obviously, every game is absolutely massive for the Rangers, as it is for all the other teams in that Eastern Conference chase there.
You talked about, emulating the Capitals or the Devils with a retool. What do you think that means that happens? What happens between now and the trade deadline?
Between now and the trade deadline, it will be somewhat dictated, I think, by how the Rangers do between now and then, because obviously if they go on another little run here, then maybe they, I would say, are soft buyers, I guess would be the term. Like, I don't see them doing any, they already made their big move. That's JT Miller. I don't think there's going to be another move like that. And even if there was, they might not have the cap space for it. But I think you could see them add on a little bit. If things go south, then I think certainly what will happen is you'll see some of the impending UFAs probably shipped out of town. Riley Smith is here. First season, he's in the last year of his deal. I think he's somebody that for sure would be on the move in exchange for maybe a draft pick. Ryan Lindgren, who, this guy has played his heart out for years with the Rangers, but he's having a tough time this season. I think the injuries have really caught up to him and had a little bit of a shaky game today, even though the Rangers won. I think you'd see him get dealt. He's in the last year of his deal. Jimmy Vesey finally got back into the lineup today. Not that you get a king's ransom for Vesey, but he'll be a UFA after the season too. So I think, if the Rangers fall out of it, you'll see them move those guys and replace them with some of the guys in the AHL, whether that's Brandon Othman, former first-round pick, Brett Berard, who was up earlier this season. It all depends on how they do between now and then. So going to be very, very interesting to see the Rangers, their fate is in their own hands, I think is the best way to put it.
JT Miller, obviously, there were some issues with him in the locker room in Vancouver. There have been some issues in the locker room for the Rangers this year as far as team chemistry, who doesn't like who, more toward management maybe than teammates. But does adding JT Miller put more volatility into this team, or do you think he'll fit right in? He's been here before.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly a possibility. Like I said, there's a wide range of outcomes when it comes to JT Miller and how this ultimately plays out, during his second tenure with the Rangers here. But this team needed a shock to the system. They needed a jolt in the worst kind of way. Things have just been kind of stale this season, and effort has been lacking from some very important players on this team pretty much, off and on throughout the entire season. So, JT Miller, things went bad in Vancouver. With the last handful of games with the Canucks notwithstanding, I don't think you're going to look at JT Miller and think like, oh, the effort's not there, the intensity's not there, the fire's not there. If nothing else, he's going to give you that in spades every single night. Now, could that clash with some of the personalities in the Ranger locker room? That's at least possible. But at this point, the way things have gone this year, it's a risk I'm willing to take. And like I said, it comes back to the retooling concept that I talked about earlier. I think some of these guys that maybe he might clash with might be gone by next season anyway. It's at least possible. So we'll see how it all shakes out. But again, it's all about risk versus reward. And for me, there's enough of a reward here getting JT Miller at a discount that I'm willing, at least for one. They didn't ask me, but I would be willing to take that risk if I'm the Rangers going forward for the next, however many years that Miller ends up being here.
All right, John, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, wherever you're listening to this, watching this, you can find Locked On New York Rangers there as well. We're on YouTube, and you can find me at jchick17 on Twitter, at jchik17. Give us a follow, come talk some hockey, and we'll see how it shakes out this year for the Rangers.
All right, thanks, John.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guest, Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild, Dan Holmi of Locked On Capitals, and John Chick of Locked On New York Rangers for joining me today. Don't forget, we are here every day, Monday through Saturday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the NHL, and our Saturday show focuses on women's hockey. So don't forget to check that out with Erica L. Ayala. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.